The household, when properly examined, revealed itself to be precisely the sort of establishment one might expect from a man who had devoted his life to the meticulous tallying of other people's expenditures. Everything in Ashford Manor spoke of comfort achieved through vigilant economy. The carpets were good, but worn to the thread in precisely those areas where servants were most likely to walk. The furnishings were substantial, but dating from an era when substantial implied permanence rather than fashion, and the kitchen, which Whimsy visited with the sort of casual interest that made Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, regard him with profound suspicion, revealed a ledger system so elaborate that one might have believed the household engaged in banking rather than mere cooking. It was Mrs. Finch who proved most illuminating, though not, initially, about matters of immediate relevance. She had served Mr. Ashford for 23 years, she informed Whimsy, with the pride of one who had survived a particularly demanding military campaign, and in that time she had learned to anticipate his requirements with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. She knew, for instance, that he took his morning tea at 7 o'clock precisely, that he preferred his eggs boiled for exactly 4½ minutes, and that he had, without exception for the past decade, worked in his study from 9:30 until noon, at which point he would emerge for luncheon with all the ceremony of a sovereign departing the throne-room. This routine had been maintained even on the morning of his death, though when Whimsy inquired whether Mr. Ashford had seemed in any way unusual, Mrs. Finch became oddly evasive. He had seemed quiet, she ventured, which Whimsy took to mean something rather more specific than mere silence. When pressed with his characteristic mildness, she admitted that he had seemed preoccupied, a term she qualified by noting that he had eaten his breakfast without remarking upon the marmalade, a deviation from established protocol of sufficient magnitude to warrant notation. The study itself, when examined with greater particularity than Inspector Stanfield had deemed necessary, revealed certain peculiarities. The windows, though closed, did not lock, a fact which Whimsy confirmed through the simple expedient of attempting to open them, an action which drew sharp approval from Stanfield, who seemed to regard tampering with evidence as a form of social incontinence. The carpet, a Persian piece of considerable age, bore evidence of recent disturbance, not in any dramatic sense, but rather in the manner of careful rearrangement, as though someone had moved it fractionally and then attempted to restore it to its original position. The desk bore the usual appurtenances of a man of business, a blotting pad, writing implements in a silver stand, a correspondence file, and an appointment book which Whimsy requested with all the authority of a man accustomed to having such requests granted. Inspector Stanfield demurred, suggesting that such matters were the province of the police investigation proper, but when Whimsy remarked that he presumed they had already photographed and catalogued the contents, the inspector reluctantly produced the book with visible reluctance. The entries proved unremarkable until one reached the day preceding the death, at which point Whimsy observed a single notation, in Ashford's cramped, precise handwriting: Rectory, 3 p.m. Confidential. The word confidential, underlined twice, suggested matters of some significance, and yet when Whimsy inquired whether Mr. Ashford had indeed visited the rectory, Miss Catherine appeared momentarily startled. Before recovering herself, her uncle had mentioned no such appointment, she insisted, though she acknowledged that she had been occupied with estate accounts for much of the afternoon and might have missed his departure. When asked directly whether the vicar, Mr. Edmund Carruthers, had recently called upon her uncle, Miss Catherine's composure developed a hairline fracture. They had corresponded, she admitted, regarding parish matters, a term sufficiently vague to encompass anything from ecclesiastical architecture to the mating habits of ecclesiastical archdeacons. Whimsy's subsequent interview with Mr. Carruthers, conducted in the rectory's study with the vicar perched uncomfortably upon a chair that seemed designed to encourage penitence, proved illuminating in its very reticence. Mr. Carruthers was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the soft features of one who had spent his life counseling others rather than confronting them directly. He acknowledged the appointment, confirmed that Mr. Ashford had visited, and stated with apparent firmness that the matter had concerned the church fund, a matter of donations and charitable contributions utterly devoid of controversy or dramatic potential. And yet his eyes, which were the sort of pale blue that suggested either considerable honesty or considerable practice at appearing honest, flickered rather noticeably when Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Ashford had been in good spirits during this visit. The vicar demurred, suggested that Ashford had seemed troubled, and then, with the sort of discomfort that suggested he was violating some form of pastoral confidence, admitted that Ashford had inquired about the possibility of making a substantial anonymous donation to the church-building fund, a request so uncharacteristic as to suggest either approaching death or approaching madness. Wimsey had thanked the vicar with genuine courtesy and returned to the manor, where he requested tea in the library and seated himself with an air of a man settling in for considerable contemplation. Inspector Stanfield, observing this behavior, inquired whether Lord Peter had reached any conclusions, a question which Wimsey deflected with a remark about the educational value of uncertainty. But his mind, beneath the surface of apparent aimlessness, was assembling facts with methodical precision, and they were beginning to form a pattern, faint, certainly, and lacking clear outline but present nonetheless, that suggested Gerald Ashford's obvious guilt might be precisely the sort of gift that came with considerable complications attached. Gerald Ashford presented himself to Wimsey's examination on the following morning with the demeanor of a man who had spent a considerable portion of the night convincing himself that innocence was a commodity best displayed through aggressive denial. He was, as stated in the preliminary reports, 32 years of age, possessed of the sort of faded good looks that suggested a youth spent in comfortable dissipation, and an adulthood devoted to the increasing awareness that comfortable dissipation requires a steady income. His suits were fashionable, but fraying at the cuff. His shoes were polished, but bearing the unmistakable scars of repeated resoling, and his fingernails, a detail which Wimsey noted with the precision of one who understood that fingernails frequently betrayed their owner's secrets, bore the yellowish staining suggestive of considerable tobacco consumption, combined with the anxiety which tobacco consumption typically accompanied. When Wimsey inquired, with apparent casualness, whether Gerald had been fond of his uncle, the young man's response came with the alacrity of rehearsal. As fond as any nephew might be of an uncle devoted to the meticulous documentation of one's financial failures, Gerald had responded, managing a smile which suggested he believed wit might serve as adequate substitute for candor. He admitted freely to the quarrel at the dinner party, characterized it as a trifling disagreement regarding household expenses, and produced documentary evidence that he had been in the morning room at the time of his uncle's death, having spent the hours between 9 and noon reading a novel of admittedly negligible literary merit. The morning room, he added with what might have been defensiveness, or might have been simple statement of fact, was situated on the opposite side of the manor from the study, separated by a distance of some 40 feet and 2 intervening chambers. When Wimsey inquired whether the morning room possessed a clear acoustic connection to the study, a question which caused Inspector Stanfield to regard him with renewed bewilderment, Gerald appeared uncertain. The study door was soundproofed, he ventured. His uncle had been particular about such matters, something regarding the need for uninterrupted concentration during business hours. This information proved sufficiently interesting to warrant deeper investigation, and Wimsey accordingly conducted an experiment which, though it violated no laws of evidence, certainly violated the inspector's emerging conviction that his London colleague was engaging in pure theatrical affectation. Wimsey positioned himself in the study, had Gerald strike the large brass bell located upon the study mantelpiece with considerable force, and then walked the corridor toward the morning room, timing his progress and noting the degree to which the sound diminished, with distance and intervening barriers. By the time he reached the morning room, the bell's tone had become entirely inaudible, a fact which proved rather significant when one considered that a gentleman being St. Ruck with a 14th-century mace might reasonably be expected to issue some audible protest. Gerald's claim that he had heard nothing, seen nothing, and remained peacefully absorbed in his novel therefore required either remarkable concentration or remarkable fortuitous circumstance. Wimsey returned to the study, thanked Gerald with impeccable courtesy, and suggested that the young man refrain from travel outside the county pending further inquiry. This instruction was delivered with such casual assurance that Gerald seemed to accept it as settled fact rather than request, departing with the visible relief of a man temporarily reprieved from execution. Inspector Stanfield, following Whimsy into the study and closing the door with deliberate firmness, inquired whether they might discuss the investigation in terms which, while perhaps less theatrical, possessed greater practical application. His tone suggested that Whimsy's examination of soundproofing represented a deviation into territory reserved for conjurers and spiritualists, rather than serious investigators. Whimsy responded with patent innocence that he had merely been confirming the acoustic properties of the room, a matter of some relevance, surely, when attempting to establish what various parties might or might not have heard at critical moments. The inspector, his patience visibly straining, suggested that the matter was rather straightforward. Gerald Ashford, motivated by financial desperation, had entered his uncle's study at some point during the morning, seized the mace in a moment of either calculated rage or impulsive fury, and had struck down his uncle with sufficient violence to render further discussion of the matter permanently impossible. The missing weapon, which surely Gerald had subsequently hidden, would eventually be recovered. Meanwhile, the evidence pointed with admirable clarity toward a single, obvious conclusion. Whimsy had nodded with apparent acceptance of this reasoning, which seemed to mollify the inspector considerably, until Whimsy casually inquired whether the inspector had given consideration to the matter of the radiators. "The radiators," Stanfield repeated, with the tone of a man beginning to suspect that London air possessed hallucinogenic properties, had commenced functioning with uncharacteristic efficiency on the morning of the murder, a fact which, while perhaps worthy of gratitude to whatever plumber had finally attended to them, seemed rather distant from the matter of determining whether Gerald Ashford had committed homicide. Whimsy had agreed that it seemed distant, which was precisely why it intrigued him, and had proceeded to request the name and address of the plumber in question. This individual, when located and interviewed at his workshop in the nearby village of Moreton-in-Marsh, proved to be a taciturn gentleman of 60 years named William Proctor, whose responses to questioning possessed all the expansiveness of a man communicating through a series of carefully rationed grunts. He had been summoned to the manor, he confirmed, by Miss Catherine Ashford on the morning in question, summoned at approximately 8:30, the precise moment when the body was being discovered above his head in the study. The radiators had required substantial work, old pipes, corroded joints, the sort of employment which occupied a plumber's morning with profitable regularity. When Whimsy inquired whether this work had necessitated his presence in the study itself, Proctor's response came with the sort of delay which suggested careful consideration of the implications. He had entered briefly, he admitted finally, to examine the radiator located beneath the study window, a radiator which had, in the manner of such fixtures, required bleeding tea or remove accumulated air from the pipes. The revelation that William Proctor had entered the study at the precise moment when its occupant was being discovered in a state of permanent repose presented itself to Whimsy with the subtle significance of a perfectly placed chess piece. He inquired, with his characteristic air of discussing nothing in particular, whether Mr. Proctor had observed Mr. Ashford during this entry, a question which caused the plumber to shift his weight with visible discomfort. Ashford had been seated at his desk, Proctor confirmed, appearing to be occupied with correspondence or some similar business, entirely unaware of the plumber's presence in the room. When Whimsy pressed the matter further, inquiring specifically whether Ashford had seemed alive at that juncture, Proctor responded with the sort of wounded dignity that suggested the question bordered on impertinence. Of course the man had appeared alive, he had said curtly. He had walked past him, had even excused himself for the intrusion, and Ashford had merely waved him onward with an absent gesture. The timing of this observation proved rather critical, for when Whimsy consulted with the village doctor, a competent if uninspired gentleman named Harrison, who had performed the preliminary examination of the body, he learned that death had occurred within a window of several hours prior to discovery, the morning itself certainly, but with sufficient latitude to accommodate any number of temporal permutations. Ashford might have been alive when Proctor entered at 8:30, or might have been dead for some hours prior. The doctor could not say with certainty. The rigor mortis was only beginning to establish itself. The body temperature had declined according to predictable mathematical ratios, but none of these observations permitted the sort of precision which Inspector Stanfield clearly desired. Whimsy had thanked the doctor with genuine appreciation and returned to the manor, where he conducted himself with the air of a man entirely satisfied with his investigation and prepared to depart. This demeanor proved sufficiently convincing that Inspector Stanfield, encountering him in the entrance hall with luggage in hand, expressed considerable surprise. Whimsy had not solved the matter, the inspector noted with the tone of one pointing out a self-evident failure. Whimsy had agreed that he had not solved it, not yet, though he suspected he might require perhaps another day or two of quiet contemplation. In the meanwhile, he suggested, it might prove instructive to examine whether any member of the household had recently undergone significant alteration in their financial circumstances, a suggestion which Stanfield dismissed as speculation unworthy of serious investigative methodology. Whimsy had shrugged with apparent acceptance and proceeded to book himself into the village hotel, where he spent the remainder of the day in his room with nothing but a bottle of exceptionally good claret and what appeared to be a state of profound ennui. It was during this period of apparent idleness that Whimsy received an unexpected visitor in the person of Miss Catherine Ashford, who arrived at the hotel as evening shadows lengthened across the market square with an air of considerable nervous purpose. She had, she explained to Whimsy, in the privacy of the hotel sitting-room, come to discuss a matter of some delicacy which she had not felt able to address in the presence of the police inspector. Her uncle, she stated with evident reluctance, had not been precisely the man that official records and public demeanor suggested. He had maintained certain habits, certain associations, which would have scandalized the village had they become general knowledge. When Whimsy Inc. eyed what specific habits and associations she referenced, Miss Catherine's composure developed an unmistakable tremor. Her uncle had, she explained with considerable circumspection, been engaged in a prolonged correspondence with a woman, not a woman of inappropriate social station, certainly, but a woman who was decidedly not her uncle's wife. The correspondence had become increasingly ardent over the past 18 months, increasingly desperate toward the end, and increasingly focused upon matters of financial provision and future arrangement. When Whimsy inquired the identity of this mysterious correspondent, Miss Catherine produced a letter, carefully retrieved from her uncle's study desk following his death, which bore the signature of one Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, who resided in London and who, according to the postmark and the several references within the text to our child, appeared to be considerably more than a mere correspondent. The letter itself, written in an educated hand with considerable emotional intensity, contained references to years of separation, to a promise made in youth which had been subsequently abandoned, and to a request for financial settlement that Ashford appeared to have been contemplating with considerable internal conflict. When Whimsy inquired whether Miss Catherine possessed any knowledge of this woman's identity prior to discovering the correspondence, she admitted that she did not, but that careful examination of her uncle's private papers had revealed a will dated some weeks prior to his death, a document which had apparently been drawn up in consultation with a solicitor in London and which designated Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood as the recipient of a substantial bequest, some £15,000, a sum representing approximately 1/3 of Ashford's total estate. This bequest, Miss Catherine noted with evident bitterness, left G. Errold with considerably less than he might have expected to inherit, circumstances which might adequately explain both his financial anxieties and his quarrels with his uncle regarding household economies. When Whimsy inquired whether Inspector Stanfield had been made aware of these discoveries, Miss Catherine admitted that he had not. She had only discovered the letters herself that morning and had felt some hesitation in presenting them to a man who appeared to have already formed his conclusions regarding Gerald's guilt. Whimsy had thanked her with genuine warmth, had assured her that the information proved invaluable, and had suggested that she might retire with the comforting knowledge that the truth, however complicated, was beginning to assert itself against the convenient fiction that Gerald Ashford represented. After Miss Catherine had departed, Whimsy remained seated in the hotel's private sitting-room, the letter from Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood resting upon the table before him, and his expression underwent the subtle alteration which those who knew him well had learned to recognize as the preliminary stages of intellectual satisfaction. The discovery of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's existence presented itself to Whimsy with a sort of clarifying inevitability that suggested the entire investigation had hitherto been conducted in a state of deliberate myopia. He dispatched a telegraph to his London solicitor with instructions to locate and contact Mrs. Blackwood, requesting an interview at her earliest convenience, and then settled himself into the hotel's somewhat inadequate library to contemplate the implications of a 30-year-old secret. The letter itself bore examination of considerable subtlety, for while it contained declarations of emotional attachment and financial necessity, it also contained something far more significant, a tone of resignation suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood had long ago abandoned expectations of Ashford's willingness to publicly acknowledge their relationship or their offspring. The references to our child appeared only obliquely, always circumspectly, as though even in private correspondence the author feared discovery. When Whimsy contrasted this carefully guarded language with the apparent generosity of the new will, a will which designated her as recipient of so substantial a sum, he perceived the outline of a man in the final stages of moral reckoning, a man who, whether through approaching death or approaching conscience, had determined to make such restitution as his circumstances permitted. The question which then presented itself was whether this restitution had occurred too late, or whether it had occurred in time but not in the manner which certain interested parties had anticipated. On the following morning, a reply arrived from Whimsy's solicitor indicating that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood was indeed discoverable at a respectable address in Kensington, and that she had expressed willingness to receive Lord Peter Whimsy at her residence on the afternoon of the subsequent day. Whimsy had accordingly departed the hotel with the air of a man whose investigation, while remaining ostensibly inconclusive, had begun to acquire definite direction. The train journey to London provided ample opportunity for consideration of the various narrative threads which had thus far presented themselves, threads which, when properly assembled, seemed to form a pattern considerably more complex than Inspector Stanfield's straightforward accusation of filial greed. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's residence proved to be a townhouse of respectable but decidedly modest character, the sort of establishment maintained by a woman of limited but stable means, the sort which suggested a life devoted to quiet respectability rather than fashionable display. The woman herself, when she received Whimsy in her small but meticulously maintained drawing-room, presented a figure of perhaps 55 years, possessed of the sort of faded beauty which suggested that youth had once counted among her assets, and that time had not been entirely kind to her in the intervening decades. Her composure, however, remained admirable, and when Whimsy introduced himself and explained the nature of his inquiry, she received the information with the sort of calm resignation which suggested she had long ago anticipated this particular complication. She admitted freely to the correspondence with Cornelius Ashford, confirmed the existence of their illegitimate son, now a man of 31 years, employed as a solicitor's clerk in Portsmouth, and acknowledged receipt of a letter from Ashford's solicitor notifying her of the bequest contained in his most recent will. When Whimsy inquired whether she had entertained hopes that Ashford might acknowledge his paternity prior to his death, Mrs. Blackwood's response came with the sort of weary candour that suggested she had long ago relinquished such hopes. Ashford had been, she explained, a man of considerable principle which, it had transpired, extended primarily to the preservation of his social reputation and the maintenance of his carefully constructed public persona. The years of their relationship had been characterized by Ashford's willingness to provide financial support for their son's education and establishment, coupled with his absolute refusal to acknowledge the boy's existence to anyone beyond a carefully circumscribed circle of his own solicitors and bankers. When she had learned of his intention to include her in his will, she admitted she had experienced a complicated mixture of emotions, gratification that he had finally determined to make what restitute shorn he could, combined with a certain bitterness regarding the lifetime of concealment which had preceded this belated generosity. Whimsy inquired whether her son possessed knowledge of his paternity, a question which caused Mrs. Blackwood to pause before responding. Her son believed himself to be the natural child of a gentleman of means who had died many years prior, she explained, a fiction she had maintained with considerable devotion throughout his childhood and into his adulthood. Only recently, within the past year, had she revealed the truth to him, a revelation prompted by Ashford's increasing correspondence and his apparent determination to provide financial provision beyond what concealment would normally have permitted. When Whimsy pressed for greater specificity regarding this revelation and its timing, Mrs. Blackwood admitted that her son had responded to the truth with a combination of shock and, subsequently, what she characterized as considerable resentment. He had felt himself deceived, she explained, not merely regarding his parentage, but regarding the entire narrative of his life. The discovery that his true father had been an obscure Cotswold banker, a man he had never met, had apparently struck him with particular force, particularly in light of the revelation that Ashford had been unwilling to claim him publicly, despite providing financial support privately. Whimsy had listened to this account with mounting interest, his seemingly casual inquiries gradually assembling themselves into a structure of considerable architectural complexity. When he inquired whether her son had maintained contact with his biological father following this revelation, Mrs. Blackwood's response came with evident reluctance. Her son had, she admitted, traveled to Cotswold on one occasion some months prior, had apparently attempted to arrange an interview with Ashford. But the interview had apparently not occurred. At least, Ashford had made no mention of it in his subsequent correspondence. When pressed regarding the exact timing of this aborted meeting, Mrs. Blackwood consulted a calendar she kept in her writing desk and confirmed that it had occurred approximately 4 months prior to Ashford's death. Whimsy had absorbed this information with apparent tranquility, had thanked Mrs. Blackwood with genuine courtesy, and had departed the residence with the air of a man whose investigation had suddenly acquired rather more weight and substance than it had previously possessed. The matter of locating and interviewing Mrs. Blackwood's son, one Mr. Richard Blackwood, proved considerably more straightforward than Whimsy had anticipated, for the gentleman in question maintained an office address in Portsmouth, which was readily discoverable through the professional registry of solicitors' clerks maintained by the Law Society. A telegram dispatched that same evening produced a response indicating that Mr. Blackwood would be available for interview on the following afternoon, news which Whimsy received with the air of a man whose investigation, while remaining outwardly focused upon peripheral matters, had begun to acquire genuine direction. The railway journey to Portsmouth provided ample opportunity for reflection upon the curious architecture of deception which had thus far presented itself, a deception maintained across 3 decades involving multiple parties and predicated upon Cornelius Ashford's unwavering commitment to the preservation of social respectability at the expense of human acknowledgement. Richard Blackwood's office proved to be located above a haberdasher's establishment in one of Portsmouth's less fashionable commercial districts, a situation which suggested financial circumstances of modest but respectable character. The man himself, when Whimsy was admitted to his modest workspace, presented a figure of approximately 31 years, as stated, possessed of the sort of features which suggested substantial resemblance to the photographs of Cornelius Ashford, which Whimsy had examined in the Manor's drawing-room, a resemblance which, while perhaps not immediately obvious to the untrained eye, became evident enough upon careful observation. Whimsy's introduction of himself produced an immediate alteration in the young man's demeanor, a tightening of features which suggested that the presence of Lord Peter Whimsy represented something considerably more significant than a mere social call. Mr. Blackwood was, he stated without preamble, entirely willing to discuss his relationship with his biological father, though he harbored considerable doubt regarding the relevance of such discussion to whatever investigation had prompted Whimsy's appearance. When Whimsy inquired whether Mr. Blackwood had indeed attempted to secure an interview with Cornelius Ashford approximately 4 months prior, the young man's response came with visible reluctance. He had travelled to Cotswold, he admitted, had presented himself at the Manor, had requested an audience with Ashford regarding matters of personal significance, a request which had been refused with what Mr. Blackwood characterized as considerable coldness. When pressed regarding the specific nature of this refusal, Mr. Blackwood admitted that Ashford had declined to receive him, had sent word through the housekeeper that such interviews were inappropriate and unwelcome, and had made clear through the intermediary that further attempts at contact would be regarded as harassment. The rejection, Mr. Blackwood explained with evident bitterness, had struck him with particular force precisely because it had confirmed what he had begun to suspect upon learning. The truth of his parentage, that Cornelius Ashford, despite 3 decades of financial provision, regarded his illegitimate son as nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of moral transgression, a person to be managed and paid rather than acknowledged and claimed. When Wimsey inquired whether this rejection had prompted any subsequent attempts at contact, Mr. Blackwood initially demurred before admitting with visible reluctance that he had written to his father. The term itself seemed to cause him considerable discomfort on several subsequent occasions, letters which had received no response. When Wimsey inquired specifically regarding the content of these letters and the timing of their transmission, Mr. Blackwood appeared increasingly uncomfortable. The letters, he admitted, had contained expressions of both anger and desperation, had outlined Mr. Blackwood's financial circumstances, which he characterized as considerably strained, and had concluded with a request for financial assistance of some substantial character. When pressed regarding the specific sum, Mr. Blackwood admitted that he had requested £3,000, funds which would have permitted him to establish an independent practice as a solicitor rather than continuing his employment as a clerk. The request, as Mr. Blackwood explained with considerable bitterness, had apparently been ignored until such time as Ashford's solicitor had contacted Mrs. Blackwood with notification of the bequest. Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Blackwood had been informed of his inclusion in Ashford's financial arrangements prior to his death, a question which produced visible surprise in the young man's features. His mother had written to him regarding the bequest, he admitted, had informed him that his father, again the term seemed to carry considerable emotional weight, had apparently determined to provide financial provision, though the sum mentioned, approximately £5,000, represented an inheritance designated to his mother rather than to himself. The revelation that his father had, at the final moment, determined to provide financial restitution appeared to produce in Mr. Blackwood a complicated mixture of emotions. Gratification combined with something that might have been guilt or might have been shame. When Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Blackwood had maintained any contact with his father following the initial rejection at the manor, the young man's response came with unmistakable hesitation. He had not, he stated finally, maintained direct contact, though he had, he admitted with evident reluctance, travelled to Cotswold on one subsequent occasion, approximately 6 weeks prior to Ashford's death. On that occasion, he had not approached the manor directly, but had instead observed his father from a distance, had in fact watched Ashford departing the manor on horseback, and had followed him to the village where Ashford had apparently conducted some business at the rectory. Mr. Blackwood had not approached him, he insisted, had not made his presence known, but had been struck by the observation that his father appeared considerably aged and considerably troubled. When Wimsey inquired specifically regarding the date of this observation, Mr. Blackwood consulted a personal calendar and provided a date which placed the incident precisely 3 weeks prior to Ashford's death, placing it, in other words, in temporal proximity to the vicar's cryptic notation regarding Ashford's confidential visit to the rectory. The revelation that Richard Blackwood had maintained surveillance of his father, however passive such surveillance might have been, presented itself to Wimsey with the sort of significance that justified his earlier preoccupation with seemingly irrelevant details. He inquired, with characteristic mildness, whether Mr. Blackwood had retained any documentary evidence of this particular journey to Cotswold, a question which produced visible surprise in the young man's features. When pressed regarding the specific manner of travel and the precise circumstances of the observation, Mr. Blackwood produced a railway receipt indicating his journey from Portsmouth to Cotswold on the date in question, coupled with a hotel bill from a modest establishment in the village confirming his residence there for a period of 3 days. The documentation, while circumstantial, suggested careful preservation of evidence, the sort of evidence one retained not from idle habit, but from awareness that such documentation might eventually prove necessary. When Whimsy inquired whether anyone had been aware of Mr. Blackwood's presence in the village, the young man admitted that he had endeavored to remain unobserved, though he acknowledged that the hotel proprietor would presumably retain some memory of his visit. Whimsy had thanked Mr. Blackwood with apparent satisfaction, and had departed Portsmouth with the air of a man whose investigation had begun to acquire definite architectonic structure. The return journey to Cotswold was accomplished with considerable expedition, Whimsy's mind occupied with the curious mechanics of motive and opportunity which seemed to be gradually assembling themselves into coherent pattern. Upon arrival at the village, Whimsy immediately sought out the proprietor of the modest hotel at which Richard Blackwood had allegedly resided, a taciturn individual named Hawkins, who required considerable persuasion before admitting that a gentleman matching Mr. Blackwood's description had indeed been a guest some weeks prior. The gentleman had been quiet, Mr. Hawkins recalled, had kept largely to his room, and had apparently spent considerable time observing the village from his window on the upper floor. When Whimsy inquired whether this gentleman had, during his stay, conducted any business or received any visitors, Mr. Hawkins admitted that he had not. The gentleman appeared entirely self-contained, devoted to solitary contemplation rather than social engagement. This information, while seemingly innocuous, suggested to Whimsy that Richard Blackwood's visit represented not a casual inspection but rather a period of careful deliberation, the sort of deliberation which might accompany the formation of serious intention. Whimsy then made a second call upon the vicar, Mr. Edmund Carruthers, whom he discovered in his study engaged in the composition of his Sunday sermon, an activity which he relinquished with what appeared to be genuine relief upon observing Whimsy's arrival. When Whimsy inquired whether the vicar had received any unexpected visits from strangers during the period approximately 3 weeks prior, Mr. Carruthers appeared initially uncertain before responding that yes, he had indeed observed a young gentleman loitering about the rectory grounds on 1 or 2 occasions, though the individual had never approached the house directly and had subsequently disappeared. When pressed regarding the specific timing of these observations, Mr. Carruthers placed them in proximity to a particular afternoon when Ashford had visited the rectory to discuss matters of conscience, a characterization which proved sufficiently intriguing to warrant deeper investigation. Whimsy inquired whether these matters of conscience had concerned Ashford's intentions regarding financial provision, a question which caused Mr. Carruthers to exhibit visible discomfort. Ashford had indeed discussed the matter of his will, the vicar admitted, had expressed considerable agitation regarding the disposition of his estate, and had apparently sought spiritual counsel regarding questions of moral obligation and familial responsibility. When pressed regarding specific details of this conversation, Mr. Carruthers demurred, suggesting that pastoral confidence required discretion, though he acknowledged that Ashford had appeared to be laboring under considerable emotional burden and that the conversation had concerned matters relating to repentance and restitution. Whimsy had departed the rectory with the air of a man whose investigation had begun to acquire the clarity of approaching resolution. The remaining piece of the puzzle required examination of the scene itself, the study in which Cornelius Ashford had met his end, and particularly the matter of the radiators and their timing. Upon returning to the manor, Whimsy requested permission to conduct a final examination of the study, a request which Inspector Stanfield granted with visible reluctance, his conviction regarding Gerald's guilt apparently unshaken by the emergence of alternative possibilities. Whimsy spent considerable time examining the radiator beneath the study window, examining the carpet upon which it rested, and inquiring with renewed particularity regarding the exact sequence of events on the morning of the death. It was during this examination that a servant, one of the junior housemaids whose name was Margaret, and who had thus far remained silent, tentatively offered information which she admitted she had been reluctant to provide earlier. She had, she explained, observed something odd regarding the study door on the morning in question, something which she had not mentioned previously, because she had been uncertain of its significance and had feared appearing foolish. When Whimsy inquired what this observation had entailed, The housemaid admitted that she had observed the study door being unlocked and subsequently relocked at a proxy. Mately, 7:30 in the morning, approximately 2 hours prior to the official discovery of the body. The individual who had performed this locking and unlocking had been, she believed, the vicar, Mr. Carruthers, though she admitted considerable uncertainty regarding the matter, and had refrained from mentioning it because gentlemen of the cloth were not typically suspected of criminal activity. This revelation, delivered with considerable trembling, proved to be the final architectural element which completed the structure of Wimsey's understanding. He had thanked the housemaid with genuine gentleness and had requested an immediate interview with Inspector Stanfield regarding the necessity of revising his investigative conclusions. Inspector Stanfield's response to Wimsey's suggestion that the vicar might warrant closer examination was characterized by the sort of stubborn resistance that suggested the inspector's mind had calcified around the comfortable hypothesis of Gerald's guilt. The vicar, Stanfield insisted with considerable firmness, had been a guest in the manor on the morning in question, had been present for breakfast, had subsequently conducted himself with perfect propriety throughout the day, and possessed no conceivable motive for the murder of a man with whom he maintained cordial, if occasional, social relations. When Wimsey suggested that motive might be considerably more complex than financial necessity, that it might encompass, for instance, the complications arising from a man's dying request to make public acknowledgement of secrets maintained across 3 decades, Stanfield regarded him with the expression of one being asked to contemplate geometries in dimensions beyond the ordinary. Wimsey accordingly conducted himself with the sort of patient courtesy which suggested he had encountered such resistance previously and did not regard it as necessarily permanent. He requested permission to conduct a private conversation with Mr. Carruthers, a request which Stanfield granted with visible reluctance, apparently on the theory that permitting such conversation might expedite Wimsey's departure from the investigation and allow the matter to proceed toward the convenient conclusion of Gerald's arrest and trial. Mr. Carruthers received Wimsey in the rectory study with composure which, upon closer examination, proved to mask considerable internal tension. His hands trembled slightly as he poured sherry, a beverage which he apparently felt compelled to offer despite the hour's relative earliness, and his eyes possessed the quality of a man who had not slept adequately for a considerable period. When Wimsey inquired, with characteristic mildness, whether the vicar had reconsidered certain aspects of his previous testimony regarding the morning of Ashford's death, Mr. Carruthers appeared to undergo a visible internal struggle. He had, he admitted finally, been somewhat less than entirely forthcoming regarding the precise timing of certain events, though he insisted that this omission had been motivated by pastoral discretion rather than criminal intent. When pressed regarding the specific nature of this pastoral discretion, Mr. Carruthers admitted that Ashford had, in his final conversation at the rectory, confided to him regarding the existence of his illegitimate son and regarding his increasingly tormented deliberation concerning the proper course of action, whether to acknowledge the boy publicly, whether to make financial provision, whether to attempt reconciliation despite 3 decades of estrangement and concealment. Ashford had apparently arrived at the rectory in considerable agitation, had spent more than an hour in conversation with Mr. Carruthers, and had departed with the apparent intention of returning to the manor to draft a new will reflecting his altered intentions regarding financial disposition. The vicar had, he admitted, been profoundly moved by Ashford's evident struggle with conscience, had encouraged him toward generosity and acknowledgement, and had believed himself instrumental in prompting Ashford toward a course of moral rehabilitation. When Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Carruthers had subsequently discovered any obstacle to this process of moral rehabilitation, the vicar's composure developed unmistakable fractures. He had, he admitted, become aware, through means which he preferred not to specify, that Richard Blackwood had been present in the village, had apparently been observing his father from a distance, and had apparently been entertaining thoughts considerably less benign than simple observation. When pressed regarding the source of this awareness, Mr. Carruthers admitted that Richard Blackwood had, in a moment of considerable emotional turbulence, approached the rectory and confided his presence to Mr. Carruthers, apparently seeking spiritual counsel regarding the anger and desperation which animated his surveillance. It was this conversation, the vicar explained, which had prompted him to visit the manor on the morning following Ashford's visit to the rectory. A visit undertaken, he insisted, with entirely benign intentions, regarding merely the assurance that Ashford had not suffered a setback in his process of moral determination. When Wimsey inquired specifically regarding the timing of this visit and the precise circumstances of the vicar's entry to the study, Mr. Carruthers' resistance to complete candor seemed to crumble entirely. He had, he admitted, entered the manor at approximately 7:30, had proceeded to the study with the intention of speaking privately with Ashford regarding Richard Blackwood's presence in the village, and had discovered the study door unlocked. Upon entering, he had found Ashford already deceased, positioned at his desk with an expression of peaceful finality suggesting that death had occurred some hours previously. In that moment of discovery, the vicar explained with evident anguish, he had been confronted with a terrible dilemma. The obvious conclusion, that Richard Blackwood, in a moment of rage and desperation, had murdered his father, seemed likely to follow from any report of the vicar's presence or knowledge. The alternative, that some accident had befallen Ashford, or that the death had resulted from natural causes precipitated by emotional strain, seemed equally possible. In his confusion and distress, Mr. Carruthers admitted, he had made the decision to withdraw from the study, to lock the door behind himself, and to report the discovery to no one, apparently believing that the matter would be discovered through ordinary household routine without his involvement. He had, he acknowledged with evident shame, thereby obstructed the investigation, had implicitly cast suspicion upon an innocent young man, and had permitted a guilty party, if guilt existed, to remain unidentified. When Wimsey inquired whether the vicar possessed any specific evidence regarding the identity of Ashford's actual assailant, Mr. Carruthers admitted that he possessed none. He had discovered the body already deceased, and had seen nothing which might indicate the manner or perpetrator of death. Wimsey's departure from the rectory was accomplished with the air of a man who had acquired the essential framework of truth, and now required only the careful assembly of peripheral details to complete the architectural structure. He returned to the manor and requested, with characteristic courtesy, an interview with William Proctor, T. E. plumber, whom he located conducting final repairs to the radiator system in the study itself. The interview, conducted in the study with Stanfield present but increasingly bewildered, took on the quality of a man being asked to account for observations which, while innocuous in themselves, acquired considerable significance when examined through the lens of accumulated knowledge. Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Proctor had observed anything unusual regarding the carpet in the study, whether, for instance, he had noticed evidence of recent disturbance or rearrangement. Proctor admitted, with visible reluctance, that the carpet had indeed appeared to have been moved at some point during the preceding evening or early morning, that certain dust patterns and the position of furniture legs suggested recent manipulation. When Wimsey inquired whether the carpet had been sufficiently displaced to permit access to the floor beneath it, Proctor admitted that it had, and that, in fact, when he had been working on the radiator, he had observed something beneath the carpet which he had dismissed as insignificant. A darkened stain upon the wooden floor, the sort of stain which might have resulted from any number of domestic accidents or spillages. Wimsey had thereupon requested permission to examine the floor beneath the carpet, a request which Stanfield granted with visible impatience, apparently convinced that Wimsey's investigation had descended entirely into theatrical absurdity. The carpet was accordingly moved, and the stain in question was revealed. A stain which, upon closer examination, proved to be consistent with blood staining of considerable age, apparently cleaned with imperfect thoroughness and subsequently obscured by the repositioning of the carpet. When Stanfield inquired whether this evidence implicated any particular party, Wimsey responded that it implicated, in fact, no one. Or rather, it implicated everyone and no one simultaneously, depending upon one's perspective and one's willingness to examine the evidence without prejudicial assumption. The crucial element, Wimsey explained, was not the presence of blood itself, but rather the timing of its concealment, The stain appeared to have been created and concealed at least several days prior to Ashford's death, a temporal displacement which suggested that the murder scene itself was considerably older than anyone had previously supposed. When Stanfield protested that this conclusion seemed to contradict the fundamental facts of the case, that Ashford had been discovered dead on a specific morning with evidence suggesting recent death, Whimsy acknowledged the contradiction and proposed a hypothesis which, while initially appearing improbable, resolved the contradiction with remarkable elegance. What if, Whimsy suggested, the murder of Cornelius Ashford had occurred not on the morning of his discovery, but rather several days previously? What if the body had been concealed and subsequently discovered in circumstances designed to appear contemporary with the actual death? What if, in short, the entire temporal framework upon which the investigation had been predicated was fundamentally flawed? This hypothesis, when articulated with Whimsy's characteristic precision, seemed to produce in Stanfield the sort of cognitive vertigo which accompanied the recognition that established certainties had been constructed upon false premises. When the inspector protested that such concealment would have been extraordinarily difficult to accomplish, Whimsy acknowledged the difficulty and proceeded to explain precisely how such concealment might have been managed. The study, he noted, possessed a particular advantage. It was rarely entered except by Ashford himself and the domestic staff who performed. Routine cleaning. If access to the study could be controlled, if the body could be concealed in a location not immediately obvious, perhaps, for instance, in the large wardrobe situated in the adjoining dressing room, a space which would require the application of considerable cold to preserve the remains in a state consistent with recent death, then the murder might indeed be concealed for a period of several days, until such time as circumstances permitted its staged discovery. The radiator system, Whimsy noted with particular emphasis, had been partially non-functional until the morning of the plumber's visit. The study, therefore, had been considerably colder than it would normally have been, sufficiently cold, perhaps, to preserve a body in a state which, upon superficial examination, might appear consistent with death occurring within a much shorter time frame. When Stanfield inquired what possible motive might exist for such elaborate concealment and staged discovery, Whimsy responded that the motive became apparent once one examined the question of who possessed both knowledge of the study's temporal accessibility and opportunity to arrange the plumber's visit at a specific moment. It was Miss Catherine Ashford herself who had summoned the plumber on the morning of the discovery, had arranged for his arrival at precisely 8:30, had discovered the body at precisely the moment when his presence in the house would provide an alibi-establishing witness to the fact of her discovery. When Stanfield protested that this conclusion seemed to accuse Miss Catherine of premeditated murder with elaborate stagecraft, Whimsy acknowledged the accusation and proceeded to explain precisely why such premeditation was not merely possible but inevitable, and why the motive, while seemingly absent on the surface, was in fact abundantly present for anyone willing to examine the hidden architecture of the Ashford household with sufficient care and attention. The mechanism of Whimsy's accusation, when fully articulated, possessed the terrible elegance of a proof which, once demonstrated, became impossible to deny or to regard as mere speculation. The motive, he explained to the assembled company, which now included Miss Catherine Ashford, summoned from her estate management with the sort of courtesy which preceded imminent accusation, resided in the discovery of her uncle's intentions regarding the disposition of his estate. Miss Catherine had, it appeared, been under the impression that she would inherit the manor and the bulk of her uncle's considerable wealth, an assumption which had sustained her through years of devoted service to a man of acknowledged parsimony and difficult temperament. The discovery that her uncle intended to bequeath substantial sums to the illegitimate son he had never publicly acknowledged, and to the woman who had borne that son, must have struck her with the force of profound betrayal. When Whimsy inquired whether this supposition aligned with Miss Catherine's understanding of her uncle's intentions, the woman's composure underwent a visible alteration. Her uncle had, she admitted with evident reluctance, informed her some weeks prior to his death that he intended to revise his will, that he had become preoccupied with matters of conscience, and that the distribution of his estate would not proceed precisely as she had anticipated. She had, she acknowledged, experienced considerable shock and disappointment upon receiving this intelligence. When pressed regarding whether this disappointment had motivated any particular course of action, Miss Catherine's response came with a sort of defensive rigidity that suggested the barricades of denied guilt were beginning to crumble. She admitted finally, discovered. Her uncle in his study on the afternoon preceding the night of his death had confronted him regarding the proposed revisions to his will, and had, in a moment of considerable anger, struck him with the medieval mace which hung upon the study wall. The blow had been struck in passion rather than premeditation, she insisted, had been delivered without conscious intention to inflict mortal injury, and had resulted in consequences which had horrified her even as she attempted to comprehend what she had done. In the immediate aftermath of the blow, she had discovered that her uncle, while grievously injured, was not immediately deceased. He had, in fact, remained conscious for a period of some hours, had lain upon the study floor in considerable pain and distress, and had apparently attempted to summon assistance before lapsing into unconsciousness from which he had not awakened. It was this period of protracted agony which had prompted Miss Catherine to undertake the elaborate deception regarding the timing of his death. She could not, she explained with evident anguish, permit the discovery of the body in its immediate post-mortem state, could not endure the thought of the scandal and investigation which would inevitably follow from the revelation that she had struck down her uncle in a moment of rage. She had therefore conceived the plan of concealing the body in the wardrobe situated in the adjacent dressing room, had arranged for the radiators to remain dysfunctional to preserve the remains in a state consistent with recent death, and had orchestrated the plumber's visit at a moment when she could arrange for the ostensible discovery of the body in circumstances which suggested its death had occurred that very morning. The deception had required considerable nerve and practical planning. She had maintained the fiction of her uncle's continued life by issuing instructio. NS in his name to the servants, had taken meals to the dressing room on the pretext of her uncle's desire for privacy, and had eventually arranged for the body to be repositioned at the desk when sufficiently preserved that its appearance would support the temporal hypothesis she wished to establish. When Whimsy inquired how she had accomplished the transition from wardrobe to desk without witnesses, Miss Catherine admitted that she had undertaken this final manipulation on the evening preceding the plumber's visit, had worked with considerable efficiency to position the body in its apparent state of repose, and had then cleaned the bloodstains with imperfect thoroughness before replacing the carpet. The plan had, she acknowledged, been successful in its fundamental objective of misdirecting investigation toward Gerald and away from herself, until such time as Whimsy had begun to examine the details which everyone else had accepted without question. Inspector Stanfield, during this confession, had undergone a visible transformation from skepticism to grudging acknowledgement of the elaborate architecture of premeditation and deception, which Whimsy had perceived beneath the surface of apparently straightforward facts. When he inquired whether Whimsy had, at any point during the investigation, possessed certain knowledge of Miss Catherine's guilt, or whether he had merely entertained hypotheses which subsequent evidence had confirmed, Whimsy responded with characteristic circumspection that he had entertained suspicions rather than certainties, had based these suspicions upon details which others had regarded as trivial or irrelevant, and had proceeded with the assumption that careful examination of seemingly insignificant matters, the functioning of radiators, the arrangement of carpets, the timing of plumbing repairs, would eventually reveal the structure of truth beneath, the scaffolding of deliberate deception. The investigation, therefore, had proceeded not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of observations which, when properly assembled, suggested conclusions which the available evidence could not have supported had one approached the matter with Stanfield, initial conviction regarding Gerald's guilt. Miss Catherine was accordingly taken into custody. The tentative charges against Gerald were formally withdrawn, and the machinery of justice proceeded toward the inescapable conclusion that a woman of previously respectable character had committed an act of violence motivated by betrayal, fear, and the desperate human desire to preserve one's expectations and one's place in the world against the threats posed by conscience and moral reckoning. The denouement of the Ashford affair, as Wimsey subsequently reflected upon it in the comparative tranquility of his London residence, possessed the quality of a tragedy rendered inevitable not by supernatural forces but by the ordinary human failures which animated most criminal enterprise. Miss Catherine had been remanded to custody pending trial, had retained solicitors of considerable competence, and had apparently resigned herself to the inescapable machinery of justice, with a sort of weary acceptance which suggested she had long anticipated this particular culmination. The trial itself, conducted before a judge of admirable impartiality and a jury of considerably less admirable intellectual capacity, resulted in a verdict of guilty to the charge of murder, albeit with a recommendation for mercy which reflected the jury's evident sympathy for a woman whose crime had originated in emotional distress rather than calculated malevolence. Miss Catherine had received a sentence of life imprisonment, a verdict which she had accepted without protest or apparent emotion. Standing in the dock with the composure of one who had already completed the essential work of moral reckoning and now regarded the legal machinery as merely the formal consecration of conclusions already reached in private. The matter of Richard Blackwood, that complicated young man whose distant surveillance and emotional turbulence had occupied such a significant position in Wimsey's investigation, had resolved itself with considerably less dramatic fanfare. Upon learning that his biological father had not, after all, been murdered by his own illegitimate son, but had rather been struck down by his niece in a moment of rage motivated by financial disappointment. Richard had apparently experienced a complex welter of emotions which he had attempted, with limited success, to conceal. The discovery that his father had, in his final days, determined to make financial restitution, that the bequest of £5,000, while modest, represented a genuine attempt at acknowledgement and reconciliation, seemed to produce in Richard a certain melancholic satisfaction. He had, according to subsequent reports, which reached Wimsey through the reliable channels of Fabian Herries' correspondence, accepted the bequest and had utilized the funds to establish his independent practice as a solicitor, apparently determining that his father's belated generosity, while insufficient to undo 3 decades of concealment and rejection, represented at least the possibility of partial redemption. Gerald Ashford, having been exonerated of the charges which had initially seemed to attach themselves so securely to his person, had inherited the manor and the bulk of his uncle's estate, a circumstance which seemed to produce in him neither particular elation nor particular satisfaction. He had apparently devoted himself to the management of the property with a conscientiousness which suggested that the shadow of suspicion had impressed upon him the necessity of demonstrating his fundamental respectability to a world which had briefly regarded him as a murderer. The vicar, Mr. Edmund Carruthers, had been confronted with the awkward necessity of explaining his discovery of the body and his subsequent decision to conceal that discovery, a situation which had resulted in his receiving a formal rebuke from the ecclesiastical authorities, coupled with the sort of sympathetic understanding which clerical hierarchies typically extended to men who had acted from motives of spiritual confusion rather than criminal intent. He had apparently suffered considerable anguish regarding his role in the matter, had written a letter of apology to Richard Blackwood, which that young man had graciously accepted, and had determined to devote the remainder of his ministry to the cultivation of spiritual wisdom sufficient to prevent similar failures of judgment in future circumstances. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, having received notification of her daughter's financial bequest prior to the commencement of the trial, had apparently experienced a certain bitter satisfaction regarding Cornelius Ashford's final, if posthumous, acknowledgement of his responsibilities. The woman had, according to Wimsey's understanding, devoted herself to the quiet life of Kensington, had maintained correspondence with her son regarding his legal practice and his personal affairs, and had apparently achieved a certain peace regarding the decades of concealment which had preceded her belated and equivocal recognition. Wimsey himself had returned to London with the sort of relief which suggested that the affairs of provincial England, however intellectually intriguing, possessed insufficient emotional resonance to warrant extended residence. He had, however, retained certain reflections regarding the investigatio. N itself, reflections which he had subsequently articulated to Bunter, his faithful servant, in the manner of a man processing intellectual complexity through verbal exposition. The matter had never, he had reflected, been fundamentally about the murder itself. The act of violence had been, in essence, merely the physical manifestation of emotional and psychological pressures which had been accumulating for years. The actual mechanism of the crime had been less significant than the elaborate deception which had succeeded it, a deception which had required not merely practical ingenuity, but a certain psychological compartmentalization which suggested that Miss Catherine possessed depths of ruthlessness and determination which her previous respectable existence had entirely concealed. The investigation itself had proceeded not through dramatic revelation or brilliant deduction, but through the patient accumulation of observations which others had dismissed as trivial or irrelevant. The functioning of radiators, the arrangement of carpets, the timing of plumbing repairs, the precise routing of pastoral visits, all had contributed to a mosaic which, when properly assembled, revealed not a single dramatic truth, but rather a complex architecture of human motive and human failing. Whimsy had accordingly observed to Bunter that the most interesting aspect of the entire affair was not the identity of the murderer, but rather the recognition that crimes were typically committed not by exotic villains of elaborate motivation, but by ordinary people, confronted with the ordinary human experience of disappointed expectations and threatened security. The human capacity for violence, he had reflected, required not particular evil, but merely the convergence of ordinary human selfishness with ordinary human desperation, a combination which seemed to require no special circumstance or extra. Ordinary psychological aberration, but merely the ordinary circumstances of life in a society which permitted some individuals to accumulate wealth while denying others the security they had anticipated. On this somewhat melancholic note of philosophical observation, Lord Peter Wimsey had concluded his reflections regarding the Ashford affair, had devoted himself to the pleasures of his London residence, and had awaited with his characteristic mixture of ennui and anticipation the arrival of whatever complications and mysteries the future might present.